Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the fascinating, recurring, and honestly often hidden patterns behind why wars actually break out. You know, there's this really common misconception that major global conflicts stem from just a single bad actor or one isolated incident. But when we look closely at history and political science, we can reveal the true anatomy of war. And understanding this underlying architecture, it's absolutely crucial for making sense of our world today.
So, why do wars actually happen? We so often think of conflicts as these spontaneous explosions, right? Just a sudden headline that seemingly comes out of nowhere. But history shows us a completely different reality. There is a deep, structural momentum to conflict.
Think of war kind of like building a campfire. You can't just toss a match onto a bare log and expect a roaring blaze. It takes a very precise combination of elements lining up at once. You need gathered fuel, you need added oxygen, you need a failure to contain it, and finally, you need a spark to ignite what was already a highly flammable situation. Basically, none of these elements cause a fire completely on their own.
Okay, let's start with part one, laying the fuel.
The absolute most combustible structural fuel out there is a concept known as the Thucydides trap. This happens when a rising power starts to challenge an established one, which causes both sides to miscalculate their strength. Drawn from the ancient Peloponnesian War, this perfectly illustrates the immense systemic danger of power shifts. Nations essentially feel cornered into acting aggressively, driven by a deep-seated fear of losing their position on the global stage.
And this fear feeds directly into what political scientists call the security dilemma. Put yourself in this scenario. Imagine putting up a massive, imposing fence because you feel unsafe in your neighborhood. Well, that sudden action terrifies your neighbor. So what do? They buy a fierce guard dog, which then prompts you to buy an alarm system. Without anyone actually intending to, you've triggered a spiraling escalation. In global politics, this spiral literally becomes the threat.
Add to this the hidden tripwire of alliance systems. On paper, sure, mutual defense pacts are meant to deter war. But in reality, an attack on one country legally obligates all the others to join the fray. This takes a localized, easily manageable dispute and turns it into a massive, interconnected chain reaction. In fact, this is the exact dynamic historians blame for the catastrophic escalation of World War I.
But hey, beyond structural fears and alliances, we can't ignore the raw competition over resources. Economic motives are incredibly powerful fuel. The race for land, water, oil, trade routes, markets, you name it. Sometimes nations are completely open about these motives, and sometimes, well, they dress them up in totally different, more noble-sounding justifications. But the underlying fuel driving the engine? It's exactly the same.
Which brings us to part two, adding the oxygen.
So if resources and structures are the fuel, domestic politics are the oxygen. Leaders who are under intense domestic pressure, maybe they're facing an economic crisis or mass unrest, they frequently look to external conflicts to distract their own citizens or to rally a sense of nationalism. Furthermore, autocratic regimes, which naturally have less accountability, can easily manufacture consent for war and severely miscalculate the popular resistance they might face. Internal politics literally fan the flames of international conflict. And this creates the perfect environment for us versus them thinking. When a strong sense of grievance or historical humiliation spreads through a population, it creates an intense, unifying psychology. This mindset makes war feel not just justified, but absolutely inevitable to the people who will actually be fighting it. It creates this powerful cultural oxygen where compromise suddenly feels like treason.
With the fire ready to roar, we hit part three, the failure to extinguish.
You might be wondering, with all that fuel and oxygen, why don't our diplomats just step in and put out the fire? War is incredibly costly, right? So rational actors should always prefer a negotiated deal. But it usually comes down to bargaining breakdown. Nations hold private information, and they have strong incentives to bluff about their actual strength. Think about it. If you want a better deal, you pretend you are perfectly willing to go to war. But if both sides bluff a little too convincingly, they accidentally close the door to peace.
And that leads to a really tragic, recurring miscalculation. Leaders frequently, almost predictably, overestimate their odds of a quick, cheap victory. Because information is hidden and everyone is bluffing, leaders confidently predict a swift, easy war. Just look at the disastrously confident assumptions made right before World War I, or even the U.S. Civil War. They assumed it would be a quick little skirmish, failing entirely to see the protracted nightmare that was actually ahead of them.
Finally, Part 4,
the spark versus the fuel.
It is absolutely vital that we distinguish the long-building structural causes from the specific events that actually set them off. On one hand, you have the fuel, territorial disputes, resource competition, and ethnic tension. On the other hand, you have the spark, an assassination, a sudden border skirmish, maybe a broken treaty. A trigger rarely explains a war on its own. Honestly, if the structural fuel wasn't there in the first place, that spark would simply fizzle out.
So, tying this all together, we're looking at a very specific, tragic recipe. While each of these factors can cause some damage on its own, political science shows us that catastrophic wars emerge when this recipe aligns perfectly. A deep structural rivalry, a powerful domestic incentive to fight, a catastrophic failure of diplomacy, and finally, a proximate spark that sets the whole thing off. That is the true anatomy of a conflict.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on. As global pressures shift around us today, we really have to look past the daily headlines. Are we just reacting to sparks, or are we actively watching the fuel gather? I hope this explainer has given you a clearer, much more structured lens to view the deeply complex world around us. Thanks for joining me.